Nestled in the rolling hills of Elizabeth, Illinois, is the Apple River Fort. The Apple River Fort is the location of one of the last battles in the Black Hawk War. In June of 1832, the fort was attacked by a Black Hawk, a Sauk Native American and his 200 warriors. Historians say that the women were crucial in the defense of the fort, but what role did the women play in the protection of the fort? The answer lies within the barricaded walls. Due to the discovery of lead in Galena, Illinois, miners of 1820 began to populate the surrounding area. A settlement was formed in nearby Elizabeth.
1832 and what was known as the Black Hawk War. This is where Chief Black Hawk and his warriors were moving around northern Illinois, and there were a series of conflicts.
In 1804, the Treaty of St. Louis was made. This distributed Illinois' land and pushed the local Native Americans further west. In 1832, Black Hawk and his tribe traveled east to reclaim their land. Black Hawk wanted to do it without any bloodshed. However, once other tribes decided to regain land, several battles occurred. Some of these battles included Battle of Stillman's Run, Indian Creek, and Bad Axe. When word spread about the Black Hawk War, the mining settlement was panic-stricken. To protect the small community, the men constructed a wall surrounding the buildings, thus creating the Apple River Fort.
All right, so in 1832, that spring, when it became apparent that the Sauk and other tribes were at war with the United States government, the governor of Illinois made the decision to put out an advisory for the Illinois citizens to fortify, to do what they can to secure themselves. They had to be very self-sufficient about this.
The fort was finished on May 22, 1832. With the construction of the fort at a close, the women took on their daily household chores. The women were the building blocks of the fort. The women had to cook 3 meals a day and maintain a steady fire in the kitchen.
You know, you get your fire going and you have to start your breakfast and get your breakfast done. And then by the time you finish your breakfast, you're starting lunch, because everything took a while to cook. It didn't cook really quick. You know, with fire, you got to keep it going, keep the heat and stuff.
Another task the women would do was the mending of clothing. They had to patch up pants and knit socks. The women of the Apple River Fort met all the settlers' necessities and were the backbone of the small community they had created. Whether it was the harvesting of crops or making candles, the women of the Apple River settlement were essential in the fort's survival. On June 24th of 1832, Black Hawk, the Sauk warrior, led his people to the Apple River Fort. Black Hawk and his warriors attacked the fort in need of supplies. 30 militiamen took the fort's defense.
And on June 24th, 1832, some scouts were around, American scouts, militia scouts, and they came across a band of Black Hawk and his warriors, and they managed to get inside of the fort, these militia scouts, and the battle was on. And inside the fort were 45 men, women, and children, including 22 men. Outside the fort were 200 Black Hawks and his warriors. And warriors, they knew how to fight. That's what they did for a living. So if I would have been in those shoes of the militia and the settlers inside the fort, I would be scared to death.
Because the fort was largely outnumbered, the settlers had to defend themselves with a more creative approach.
So to make it look like they had more defenders than they really did, the women, led by Elizabeth Armstrong, decided to let the men do the shooting, and the women would be making the bullets and reloading the rifles. So this little trick fooled the Indians into thinking that there were many, many more armed men inside the fort than there actually were.
After 45 minutes, with the women's help, the militia were able to fight off the Sauk warriors, forcing Black Hawk to break the siege. The Apple River Fort had proven their strength. With the bravery of their men and women, they had fought off Black Hawk and his warriors. A federal government agent was sent up from the area to make a record of everyone's losses due to the Black Hawk War. Many reported stolen horses, food, and ammunition. 3 women, who are notorious for helping the militia, were Elizabeth Armstrong, Elizabeth Winters, and Elizabeth Van Valkenburg. Elizabeth Winters' husband, John D. Winters, and the captain of the militia, Clack Stone, purchased land that would later become the village of Elizabeth.
At this time, the early 1840s, Mrs. Winters, Elizabeth Winters, did not want to live there anymore. So to convince her to stay, he decided to name this new town after her. So the town would be Elizabeth, after Elizabeth Winters. But later on, when the town was incorporated in the 1860s, the town council decided to name it after all three women, because it was rather curious that there were so many Elizabeths involved in that historic fight.
Nearly 150 years later, in 1995, the Apple River Historic Foundation decided to search for the fort's remains. An archaeologist was hired to excavate any clues they could find leading to the fort's resting place. Pottery, musket balls, and a trash pit were uncovered. Lastly, they found what they had been looking for. They unburied the 50-foot by 70-foot imprint of the fort. Using fencing, they enclosed the area. In 1996, with a group of volunteers, the reconstruction of the fort began. The volunteers used similar tools to those the settlers would have used. Once the replica of the fort was done, the doors opened to the public. Today, the Apple River Fort is listed in the National Register of Historical Places. With limited time and little resources, the settlers of Apple River were able to build a fort in a matter of weeks. The women's help provided the men with the reinforcement they needed to defend the fort. Little did the settlers know that their bravery and courage would still be honored almost 200 years later. Today, the women's heroic actions during the attack have gone unnoticed. Let's not let their contributions be forgotten. Their roles in the settlement should be dignified. The women of the Apple River Fort were truly essential in the fort's vitality.